Hello, I'm Julia, and in this video I'm going to try and explain some of the thinking behind my string quartet number 11. This one is a scherzo and trio, and it follows the typical ternary form pattern. It has a very lively scherzo, followed by a contrasting, slightly less frenetic trio, and then it returns to the opening scherzo. The structure of each scherzo section is very simple. This is basically ternary form within the scherzo as well. So we have an opening phrase in G minor, which is repeated, and this is then followed by a more chromatic phrase in which all four parts have these overlapping descending chromatic scales, which is also repeated, and then we go back to the opening phrase, which is repeated again. And the interest in all of this comes from the changes in texture. Basically, this piece is an experiment in texture. So each time we hear each of these phrases, we have a different combination of parts playing arco and parts playing pizzicato, which means that even though we're hearing the same notes each time, different parts become more or less prominent depending on where they sit within the texture. And I think that's really interesting because it means that you're hearing exactly the same thing each time, but it's never the same. And it gives you a chance to process what's going on in the inner parts, which you don't always necessarily hear. So it's kind of deconstructing the phrase. For example, the first time we hear the phrase from A, the first violin and the cello are playing arco, and the second violin and the viola are playing pizzicato, so we barely register the inner parts, although we know they're there. But when it's repeated, the parts swap over, so the first violin and the cello are now pizzicato, and the second violin and viola are now arco. So this time we hear what the inner parts are doing, and not so much of the outer parts. And they're all doing something different rhythmically and melodically. They all have something that could be considered a melody, and there's an element of syncopation in all of them. When we first hear the B section, which conveniently starts at letter B, all of the parts are playing pizzicato. But in the repeat, the first violin and the cello become arco, so the outer parts become more prominent again. And so on and so on. We keep swapping over between pizzicato and arco in different parts until we reach the end of the scherzo for the first time. And then we come to this trio section, which is a bit slower and is a different kind of experiment in texture. And we shift to D major for this, although we've still got these repeating descending chromatic motifs. So it begins with what is really a canon, in which all of the parts are offset by 2 bars each time. So the first violin starts, then 2 bars later the second violin comes in with the same thing, 2 bars after that the viola comes in, and another 2 bars after that the cello comes in. And because the descending 4 notes in the middle of each 2-bar block get progressively higher, sometimes only by a semitone from the previous time, we get this build-up of these short spiky chords in between the quavers. And after all of the parts have joined in the canon, they start to vary the rhythm slightly. So they play around with the number of quavers so that the notes that make up the spiky chords in the middle become slightly offset in each part. So we get different chords, different combinations of notes. And it starts to become more of a wash of sound in which it becomes harder to identify the bar lines, although we still have this descending chromatic flavour. And out of this wash of sound emerges this very legato melody, firstly in the cello and then later on higher in the violins. But it's still set against this backdrop containing the quavers and the descending chromatic notes. Rather than reaching a conclusion of this section and then starting the scherzo again, I wanted to see if I could somehow merge from one to the other. I thought that was quite an interesting idea, so that it would sort of catch you by surprise a little bit. So a bit like that legato melody earlier, emerging from this backdrop, elements of the scherzo theme start to emerge from the backdrop again that we've set up. First of all in the viola, and then the second violin joins in, and then the first violin, and eventually the cello, and all the while we're getting faster and faster. So eventually we end up back at the tempo we started at, and we're back into the scherzo, this time with everyone playing arco. The repeat of the scherzo does basically the same thing as before, in that the parts all swap around between pizzicato and arco, so we get new combinations each time. So we never quite hear the same thing twice, but hopefully by the end we've really heard everything that's going on in each part. So I hope that helps to explain my thinking behind this one a little bit, and that you enjoy listening to it.